The winter of 1943 settled over occupied Poland with a silence that seemed almost unnatural. The air carried a constant chill, the kind that bit through clothing and lingered in the bones. Along the roads, columns of soldiers moved like clockwork, and the rhythm of war had become an ordinary sound: boots against snow, engines in the distance, and the low hum of an occupied land learning to survive. Among the countless faces blurred by fear and hunger, there was one that did not quite fit the pattern. Her name was Jadwiga Jankowska, a former nurse from Krakow, 31 years old, calm-eyed, deliberate in her actions, and known for her stubborn composure. Before the war, Jadwiga had worked in a hospital where order, precision, and discipline defined her world. When the German invasion began in 1939, she volunteered as a field medic, refusing evacuation. She moved from unit to unit, carrying her medical bag through mud and artillery smoke, witnessing the collapse of an army that was outnumbered and unprepared. By 1942, she had joined the Polish underground as a courier, smuggling medical supplies and coded letters across provincial lines. Her capture was not the result of betrayal but of exhaustion. A routine checkpoint outside Tarnów, a guard with sharp eyes, and documents that did not match her story. She was arrested, interrogated briefly, and then disappeared into the machinery of the Reich. In the records of the SS, she was listed simply as Prisoner 1729J female, resistance suspect. That last word, female, became a logistical inconvenience. The transport she was assigned to was a shipment of male prisoners bound for a labor camp near the Silesian border, a facility primarily used for railway construction and coal extraction. There were no women's quarters, no separate facilities, and no precedent for her case. The administration, unwilling to delay, sent her anyway. What awaited her there was not planned, not discussed, and not entirely understood even by those in charge. The train journey lasted 2 days. Inside the cattle car, 47 men and 1 woman endured the darkness together. The guards offered no explanations. The prisoners avoided eye contact. In that space, silence was not respect. It was disbelief. When the train stopped, the air that entered was filled with the smell of coal dust and machine oil. The camp loomed ahead, a rectangle of fences and watchtowers. It was not one of the infamous death factories. It was a labor site, brutal, cold, but structured, designed to extract work until the body failed. When Jadwiga stepped off the train, even the guards hesitated. She wore the same striped uniform as the men, though it hung loosely around her frame. Her hair had been cut short in the transit prison, her face hollowed by hunger and fatigue. There were murmurs, a few stares, but no one spoke. She was processed, photographed, and assigned to Barrack 14, a unit filled entirely with men, all political prisoners, mostly Polish and Czech. Her presence was a disruption in the mechanical rhythm of camp life. For the guards, it was a curiosity. For the prisoners, it was a question no one wanted to answer. Over the following days, her existence in that environment began to redefine the boundaries of the camp itself. There were no accommodations for privacy, no safety, no precedent. Yet, in the strange moral geometry of survival, something unexpected began to take shape. The men in her barrack, hardened by labor, deprivation, and despair, began to treat her not as an anomaly, but as a reminder of a world that had not completely vanished. Her calmness, her silence, and her methodical work cleaning wounds and rationing food made her presence bearable, even necessary. Outside, the war continued to move like a storm on the horizon. Inside the camp, a quiet tension grew. The guards observed her with suspicion. The commandant received reports he did not understand. The men around her began to change in subtle ways, not through defiance or rebellion, but through the simple act of recognizing another human being where the system demanded none. Jadwiga, unaware of it then, had already altered the balance of the camp. What began as an administrative mistake would soon become something far more significant, a challenge to the very logic. The labor camp near Silesia operated like a machine, without pause or mercy. Every movement had purpose. Every routine was measured by a whistle, a count, or the crack of a command. When the transport from Tarnów arrived, the system absorbed its new prisoners with mechanical precision, all except one. The entry ledger recorded 48 arrivals, but the notation "female" beside one name caused hesitation in the clerk's hand. The column was not designed for exceptions. After a short exchange among the guards, the decision was made to assign her to the same roll call unit as the men. There would be no adjustments, no special treatment, no deviation from order. Jadwiga Jankowska's first days were marked by observation rather than movement. The camp's rhythm was relentless: reveille before dawn, labor from sunrise to sunset, inspection, roll call, and sleep in a barrack filled with the smell of sweat, frost, and iron. The walls were thin, the bunks crude, and the air heavy with dampness. Her section worked in railway maintenance, laying tracks, moving gravel, repairing wooden ties, under the supervision of armed guards. She was too frail for the hardest tasks, but the overseer soon realized she could serve as a medic within the work detail, tending to cuts, burns, and frostbite. It was not compassion that granted her this role, but pragmatism. A live worker was more efficient than a dead one. For the men around her, her presence was first a disruption, then a puzzle, and finally a fact. They had learned not to question the illogic of the system they inhabited. The regime provided no answers, only rules. Over time, the novelty faded. Her quiet endurance blended into the background noise of survival. Yet the guards never stopped watching. In a place where control depended on fear, the appearance of a woman among men was viewed as a variable, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. The camp itself had no walls of stone, only fences of barbed wire stretching across frozen ground. Beyond them lay forest and coal pits, and beyond those, the uncertainty of a war that shifted in direction but not in brutality. Inside the wire, hierarchy ruled: guards, capos, prisoners. Each level maintained order through coercion. Jadwiga's position defied categorization. She was a prisoner, yet the guards avoided unnecessary contact with her, and the prisoners, hardened by years of captivity, instinctively shielded her from attention. It was not chivalry. It was preservation of dignity, of something that felt human. Each morning, she joined the column that marched toward the work sites. The cold pierced through the thin fabric of her uniform, the wind cutting across open ground like a blade. The camp guards kept their distance, their rifles slung lazily but ready. When the labor began, the men bent to their tasks with mechanical focus. Jadwiga moved between them, collecting splinters, cleaning wounds with diluted alcohol, and applying strips of cloth torn from discarded garments. She did not speak. The men did not ask. Her silence became part of the soundscape, another element of survival. The guards noticed small things. The men in Barrack 14 were less prone to fights, less likely to collapse during work shifts. They shared rations more evenly, repaired one another's boots, and worked in rhythm. It was an anomaly that drew quiet attention. The commandant, a bureaucrat in uniform more than a soldier, marked it in his report as unusual cohesion. He did not attribute it to Jadwiga, but her presence was the only variable that changed. In the evenings, when the work ended, she remained near the infirmary corner of the barrack, organizing scraps of bandages and broken instruments. The camp's doctor, himself a prisoner, tolerated her methodical habits because she lightened his burden. Together, they maintained the illusion of medical order in a place designed for exhaustion. Winter deepened. The snow piled against the fence lines, and the guards began to suffer from the same cold they inflicted. Supplies grew thin, tempers shorter, disease more common. Yet Barrack 14 remained functional, its mortality rate lower than others. There was no miracle, only small acts of endurance repeated day after day. Rumors began to move quietly among the prisoners. They said the woman in Barrack 14 had been a nurse, that she once served with the Polish army, that she knew things how to disinfect water, how to treat infections, how to ration food. The truth did not matter. What mattered was the effect. Hope, in its smallest form, began to circulate. From the watchtower, the camp guards could not measure this. They saw only discipline maintained, order unbroken, quotas met. Yet beneath the surface, something unmeasurable was happening. The faint reappearance of humanity in a place built to erase it. And still, no one, not the prisoners, not the guards, not even Jadwiga herself could yet imagine how far that quiet resistance would reach. By the 3rd month of her imprisonment, Jadwiga Jankowska had become part of the camp's machinery. The rhythm of survival absorbed her completely. Days began before light, under the metallic sound of the morning whistle. The men stirred slowly, their bodies stiff from cold and hunger. The air in the barrack carried the smell of damp straw and human fatigue. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture economical. There was no space for wasted effort. Outside, the guards shouted commands with mechanical precision. The roll call stretched across the yard, numbers recited, mistakes punished by repetition. The prisoners lined up in rows, their striped uniforms indistinguishable from one another. Only Jadwiga's frame, smaller and thinner than the rest, marked a quiet irregularity in the order. The guards did not comment, but their eyes lingered. The camp existed on predictability. Anything that broke the pattern invited unease. Her days followed a narrow pattern. After roll call, she joined the infirmary detail, not a formal medical post, but a necessity created by attrition. She cleaned wounds with cold water, reused bandages, and improvised antiseptics from soap and ash. Infection was constant. Recovery was rare. Yet, within that bleak arithmetic, small victories mattered. A man who stood another day, a fever that broke overnight, these became silent affirmations that the human body could still resist systematic decay. Her hands grew rough, her skin cracked from the frost, but her focus never wavered. In a world stripped of identity, routine became both a weapon and a shield. It preserved sanity through repetition. It dulled the edge of fear. The guards noticed her efficiency and left her largely untouched. To them, she was useful, which meant invisible. To the prisoners, she was something else, a fixed point in a landscape of uncertainty. The labor remained brutal. Each day the work crews hauled timber, loaded gravel, and maintained the narrow railway line that snaked toward the mines. Accidents were common. Frostbite consumed fingers. Collapse was frequent. When a man fell, 2 others lifted him, not out of compassion, but because the line could not stop. Jadwiga's role extended beyond the infirmary. She patched the living and documented the dead, recording names when possible, initials when not. Her small ledger, kept hidden under her bunk, was the only written record of dozens of men who would otherwise vanish. The guards began to see her as part of the infrastructure, neither threat nor asset, simply necessary. The commandant's office noted her in passing reports as orderly Jankowska, unproblematic. Bureaucracy, in its indifference, granted her a form of safety. She used it carefully. Weeks became months. The seasons shifted. The snow melted into mud, and with spring came the stench of decay. Supplies arrived irregularly. New prisoners filled the camp as others disappeared. Jadwiga learned to read the signs of collapse in faces, to gauge endurance by the way a man stood during roll call. Her medical instincts, sharpened by scarcity, turned her into an observer of survival itself. Occasionally, the guards would bring wounded men from other sections. She treated them without question, indifferent to nationality or rank. Some were Poles, some Russians, some Germans in prison uniforms stripped of insignia. To her, the differences no longer mattered. The war outside had narrowed to one equation: endurance against entropy. The camp's internal order depended on obedience. Yet within Barrack 14, an unspoken system formed. The men shared fragments of bread, rotated shifts for the weakest, and concealed injuries until treatment was possible. None of it was heroic. It was pragmatic, efficient, and human. Jadwiga's presence gave it structure. The guards observed the reduced mortality and filed it as improvement in discipline. They did not understand that order could emerge without coercion. At night, the camp quieted. The wind carried the faint sound of trains in the distance, reminders of a world that continued beyond the wire. Jadwiga lay awake often, her mind moving through calculations of supplies and days, never allowing thought to drift toward hope or despair. Both were dangerous. What sustained her was purpose, not ideology, not faith, but the tangible act of maintaining life where it was designed to end. By the time spring turned to early summer, she had ceased to feel like an anomaly. Her existence in a male camp was no longer questioned. The guards saw efficiency, the prisoners saw endurance, and she saw only continuity. The camp had absorbed her, but not erased her. Beyond the fences, the war was beginning to turn. The Eastern Front was collapsing, though the men inside did not yet know it. For them, every sunrise was identical. Yet, the first faint shift in the balance, invisible, distant, had already begun to echo through the machinery of the Reich. And soon, that shift would reach even this forgotten camp, where one woman's steady presence had already changed the invisible rules of survival. By midsummer of 1944, the camp no longer felt insulated from the world beyond its fences. The sound of distant artillery began to replace the constant drone of machinery. The guards, once confident and mechanical in their routines, grew restless. Orders arrived more erratically, and the discipline that had defined their precision started to fracture. Rumors filtered through the prisoner ranks, whispers of Soviet advances, German retreats, and towns changing hands overnight. The camp existed in a strange limbo, functioning as before, yet with an undercurrent of uncertainty that touched everyone. Jadwiga noticed it first in the small details. The guards spoke less during roll call. Deliveries of coal and food became irregular. The commandant's uniform lost its sharpness. His boots remained unpolished. The lines of authority blurred, though no one dared acknowledge it openly. The men in Barrack 14 sensed the shift as instinctively as they sensed cold or hunger. Survival had taught them to read invisible signs. For Jadwiga, the change meant adaptation once more. Supplies for the infirmary dwindled to almost nothing. The antiseptics were gone, bandages replaced by rags, and painkillers non-existent. She began boiling water with scraps of herbs collected from the edge of the worksite, imitating old remedies remembered from before the war. The guards ignored her improvisations. They had larger concerns: escape attempts, missing rations, broken machinery. The system was beginning to erode. The men worked longer hours with fewer tools. Fatigue spread through the camp like a second illness. Jadwiga kept records as she always had, marking deaths in her hidden ledger with calm precision. Yet even she began to feel the weight of instability. The order that had once sustained her now faltered, and she understood how fragile that balance had been. What kept the camp functioning was not ideology but habit, and habit was breaking down. One evening, the sound of distant explosions reached the compound. The ground trembled slightly, and the guards rushed to their stations, shouting conflicting orders. The prisoners froze in uncertainty. Nothing happened. The noise faded, leaving only the hum of fear behind. For the first time, Jadwiga saw confusion in the eyes of the men who once commanded every movement. Authority, she realized, depended entirely on the illusion of control. In the following days, the camp's structure loosened further. Work details returned early, inspections shortened, punishments grew inconsistent. It was as if the machinery of the camp had begun to malfunction from within. The prisoners moved carefully, uncertain whether the change signaled danger or possibility. Jadwiga continued her work quietly, treating wounds and rationing what little food remained, yet she felt something intangible stirring among the men, not hope, not rebellion, but awareness. The order that had defined their imprisonment was unraveling, and with it came the faintest sense of possibility, fragile and undefined. The turning point had arrived, though no one could yet see its shape. The storm that once raged far away was moving closer, and soon the boundaries of the camp would no longer hold. By late summer, the camp's fragile order began to disintegrate. The routines that once defined every hour started to blur. The guards, reduced in number, appeared anxious and distracted. Rumors of approaching Soviet forces grew more persistent, carried by new prisoners from the east. The air felt heavier, charged with tension that had no clear direction. No one spoke of freedom, yet the word lingered silently in every thought. The first sign of collapse came quietly. The supply trains stopped arriving. Days passed without bread deliveries, and coal shipments ceased altogether. The kitchen rations shrank to thin soup and scraps of grain. The prisoners grew weaker, and the guards grew unpredictable. Some lashed out without reason. Others disappeared entirely, abandoning their posts under cover of night. Discipline fractured, not with rebellion, but with confusion. Jadwiga continued her work among the sick, though the infirmary had become little more than a corner of straw and cold water. The men she treated no longer spoke much. They lay still, conserving breath. The rhythm of life in the barracks slowed, until silence became its defining sound. She recorded deaths methodically, though the list now filled pages instead of lines. Her handwriting, once steady, began to waver from exhaustion. Then came the first escape. A group of 3 prisoners from another section slipped through a damaged fence during a night patrol change. No alarm sounded until morning. When the guards discovered the breach, they reacted with panic rather than authority. The punishment was delayed, disorganized, and ultimately meaningless. The illusion of control had cracked, and everyone knew it. Inside Barrack 14, the men began to act differently. They no longer rushed to the yard at the first whistle, waiting instead for the guards to appear before moving. The routines that had governed their existence became suggestions rather than laws. Jadwiga observed these changes with measured calm. Her focus remained inward, tending to the wounded, rationing food, keeping order in a world dissolving into uncertainty. The commandant's office emptied. Files were burned in small piles near the administration building. Vehicles were prepared, but never used. At night, the sound of gunfire echoed faintly from beyond the forest, distant but approaching. The prisoners listened without words. By the end of August, the camp was operating only in appearance. Work details marched out but performed no labor. The guards avoided eye contact. The chain of command had dissolved into instinct. In that strange, suspended moment, Jadwiga felt neither fear nor anticipation. She worked, as before, as if the system around her had not already collapsed. The last entry in her hidden ledger for that week read simply, "Order breaking down. Unclear what comes next." No one yet understood that the fall of the camp would not come from battle or liberation, but from the slow unraveling of structure itself, a system collapsing under its own weight. The machinery that had once defined every breath was now silent, and in that silence, the prisoners and guards alike waited for something none of them could name. The camp began to fall apart in the first days of September. It happened quietly, without a single defining event. The guards who remained no longer followed orders, they followed instinct. Some drank heavily, others stared through the fences toward the forest, as if waiting for something unseen. The commandant's building stood half empty, its papers scattered across the floor. The air carried the smell of smoke from burning records, mixed with damp earth and rusting metal. The routine that had governed every aspect of existence was gone. Roll calls were no longer held. Work details dissolved. The prisoners moved cautiously between the barracks, uncertain whether the rules still applied. The searchlights that once swept the yard each night now flickered and went dark. For the first time, darkness returned to the camp, not the artificial kind enforced by curfew, but the natural absence of light that had been missing for years. Jadwiga continued her tasks as though nothing had changed. She tended to the sick and organized the dying, her ledger filled with final entries, many without names. The infirmary was a place of quiet endurance, untouched by chaos. Around her, the men began to whisper about escape. The forest beyond the wire no longer seemed impossible to reach. Yet fear persisted. Fear of mines, of patrols, of traps. Freedom, after so long, appeared unreal. The guards began to leave. At first 1 or 2, then whole shifts. Some discarded their uniforms and vanished into the night. Others stayed, unsure whether desertion or duty offered better odds. The power structure disintegrated completely within a week. The prisoners watched from behind barbed wire that no longer mattered. The gates stood open, yet no one moved. Years of submission had shaped instinct deeper than reason. On the 7th day, the camp was empty of guards. The silence was absolute. The men gathered in the yard, uncertain what to do. Jadwiga stood among them, her face expressionless. She waited, listening for the familiar sounds of command that never came. Then, slowly, without order or speech, the group began to walk not as an escape, but as an act of continuation. They passed through the gate, beyond the perimeter that had once defined their lives. The camp remained behind them, a hollow structure of wood and wire. Smoke rose from the last burning documents, drifting into the gray sky. Jadwiga looked back only once. The place that had consumed years of human effort to maintain now lay still, defeated not by armies, but by abandonment. The collapse was complete. What remained was silence and the uncertain path forward through a landscape that was both free and unknown. The prisoners who left the camp walked without direction, moving slowly along dirt roads that had once carried supply trucks and patrols. Their steps were uncertain, shaped more by habit than hope. The landscape around them was quiet, stripped of movement. Villages lay abandoned, their roofs burned or collapsed. Fields stood untended, filled with weeds that swayed in the cold wind. It was a world emptied by war. Jadwiga moved with the group, her small figure almost lost among the taller men. She carried a cloth satchel containing her ledger, a few pieces of dry bread, and the makeshift bandages she had refused to leave behind. Her exhaustion was complete, yet her sense of duty persisted. Every few miles they stopped to rest. She examined wounds, wrapped frostbitten hands, and recorded the names of those too weak to continue. The ledger, once a record of captivity, became a map of endurance. Days passed in slow procession. They followed the sound of distant artillery, reasoning that the advancing armies might bring safety. At night, they sheltered in barns or ruins, lighting no fires. Hunger returned as their constant companion. The men scavenged for roots and rainwater. Some disappeared during the nights, seeking help or surrender. Most never returned. Eventually, they reached a river crossing where the remains of a bridge stood broken. On the far side, they saw movement soldiers, unfamiliar and indistinct in the mist. The men hesitated, uncertain whether they faced friend or foe. Jadwiga watched silently, her mind too tired for speculation. When the soldiers finally approached, speaking in rough Russian, the tension broke. Liberation, when it came, was not marked by joy, but by confusion. The Soviet troops looked at the group without recognition. They saw skeletal figures in striped uniforms, uncertain whether they were enemies or victims. Food was distributed without question. Medical attention followed. The prisoners, too weak to explain their story, simply accepted whatever was given. For Jadwiga, it was the first time in years that someone else issued orders without cruelty. In the days that followed, she assisted the Soviet medics, translating and helping identify survivors. Her professionalism returned naturally, though her body trembled from exhaustion. She gave them her ledger, the only written record of the camp's final months. The officer who received it barely glanced at the pages before setting it aside, unaware of its significance. To Jadwiga, that gesture marked the true end of the camp. What had once been order, memory, and survival now existed only as paper. When transport trucks arrived to take the survivors east for treatment, she did not protest. Her journey, once defined by captivity, now continued through liberation, a word that felt unfamiliar. She looked back one last time at the road behind her. It stretched into emptiness, bordered by silence. The world she had known was gone, replaced by the uncertain promise of peace. The aftermath was not triumph. It was survival, simple, fragile, and unfinished. After the war, records of small camps like the one near Silesia rarely appeared in official archives. Many were abandoned before liberation, their files destroyed, their names forgotten. The survivors dispersed across a ruined continent, absorbed into new borders and shifting nations. Among them was Jadwiga Jankowska, a name that appeared only once in post-war documents, listed as a nurse assisting displaced persons near Krakow in late 1945. Beyond that, the records grew silent. In the months following liberation, Jadwiga worked with relief units organized by the Red Cross. Her body had not recovered, but her discipline remained. She tended to refugees, soldiers, and orphans with the same precision she had once applied to prisoners. She spoke little of her own past. To those around her, she seemed distant, focused entirely on the present tasks of rebuilding and healing. The camp existed within her, unspoken yet constant, shaping her every gesture. The ledger she had carried through the war was handed to Polish officials and later archived in a provincial office. Most of its pages were never examined. The handwriting was small and careful, each name written as if to preserve a voice that might otherwise vanish. Decades later, historians found it. While cataloging wartime materials, they noted that it was unusually complete for a minor labor camp, detailing prisoners' origins, illnesses, and fates with clinical precision. On the final page, beneath the last entry, one sentence appeared in smaller script: "Life continued where it was not meant to." Jadwiga never sought recognition. She lived quietly in a rebuilt district of Krakow, working in a hospital until her retirement in the 1962nd. Neighbors remembered her as reserved but composed, a woman of few words and steady habits. She kept no photographs of the war, no uniforms, no mementos. The past existed for her only as a responsibility fulfilled and not to be repeated. When she died in 1972, her belongings filled a single suitcase, medical instruments, notebooks, and a folded piece of striped cloth. In the years that followed, her name resurfaced in a local exhibition on wartime resistance. A curator included her ledger as an example of quiet defiance, though few visitors lingered over it. History often celebrated battles and victories, not endurance. Yet for those who read the list of names she had preserved, the meaning was clear. In the machinery of destruction, she had chosen precision over despair, order over chaos, humanity over silence. The camp itself no longer exists. The forest reclaimed the ground where the barracks once stood. Only fragments of rusted wire remain, half buried in the soil. But within archives and memory, the quiet trace of one woman endures the record of a life sustained through discipline, compassion, and the refusal to forget. Jadwiga Jankowska left no speeches, no memoirs, no monuments. She left evidence, and sometimes In the study of history, evidence is enough.